Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the presentation of the WeWorld Index 2021. My name is Sidika Shapovia, and as a journalist, constantly in search of facts and stories to tell, and as a woman, I am particularly honored to be moderating this conversation today. WeWorld Onlus has been publishing this index since 2015 with a focus on children and women's rights and their level of inclusion in society. I invite the president of WeWorld Onlus, Marco Chiesara, to join me in welcoming you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabika, and thank you for moderating this panel. First of all, I would like to thank every one of you that are here with us today, and especially the speakers. As you mentioned, today we are here to present the 2021 WeWorld Index. But before entering in details of the index, let me say a few words about WeWorld. WeWorld is a non-governmental organization, and this year we celebrate 50 years. 50 years of fighting for rights all over the world. Consider that we work in 25 countries, including Italy. We work for rights for people in vulnerable situations, for women, for children. We fight to guarantee education, access to school, health, clean water, responses in emergency and crisis context, for the environment, for women's rights, from the fight against gender-based violence and stereotypes to empowerment and social and labor inclusion. But in order to work properly and effectively, we need to know the context in which we are intervening, as well as the needs and the challenges of those contexts. This is the reason why we also do a big research work, which always focuses on people, as in the index we are presenting today. First published in 2015, the WeWorld Index is a concise index that ranks the level of inclusion and exclusion of women and children in more than 170 countries. It's a clear picture of how inequalities are changing in the world for the most vulnerable. The index is made of 34 indicators that can be grouped in 17 dimensions, which refer to the 4 building blocks crucial for the implementation of women's and children's rights: health, education, the economy, and society, plus the environmental and cultural context, which in turn influences and is influenced by the possibilities of women's and children's rights implementation. The index, therefore, provides an analysis of the state of welfare and inclusion of women and children. November is a good month to take stock of the year, but despite the hopes and good intention of building a fairer post-pandemic world, the balance is unfortunately negative. 2021 makes the beginning of a decade that will see poverty and inequality escalate even further. Already by the 2021, 435 million women worldwide will be below the poverty line, and it is estimated that child labor could increase by 8.9 million cases in 2022. Looking a few steps further ahead, 150 million people will be at risk of needing humanitarian intervention due to climate change by 2030. Looking through the WeWorld Index, we can see how inequalities are increasing constantly, with a gap between countries in the top position like Iceland, New Zealand, Sweden, Switzerland, and Finland continuing to grow compared to the countries at the bottom: Niger, Afghanistan, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Chad. Elena Caneva will present the result in detail later, but let me underline that some data stand out more than others, such as Brazil, which has progressively abandoned the most fragile people and moves from 54th position in 2015 to 92nd, while it was 80th in 2020. The 2021 index adds a focus on climate change and its consequences, such as increased poverty, forced migration, risk of violence, or dropping out of education. One recommendation, above all, is that we need to move rapidly from the mere promotion of women's and children's rights to their concrete implementation. To do that, we have to work holistically and globally taking into account 4 dimensions I mentioned before: education, health, the economy, and society. If we don't act globally with policies and intervention that enable even the poorest and most fragile countries to grow, the process of acquiring, enjoying rights, and accessing services can only be partial and temporary, excluding the poorest country. But for change to be real, interventions must focus on a gender and generational approach, so that growth is not only the preserve of those who already enjoy greater resources. I finished here. I again want to thank everyone, and I leave the floor to Sabika. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chiesara, not just for your words, but also for the work and efforts of the organization that you head. To better understand what the causes, consequences, and solutions to these social inequalities are, I would now like to welcome Elena Caneva, coordinator of the WeWorld Study Center, who oversaw the research and who will present its main results, including this edition's focus on climate change and its consequences on women and children around the world. Elena Caneva, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sabika, and welcome to everybody. In my speech today, I'll start by describing what is the WeWorld Index and how it's made up. Then I'll move on to some of the main results of this edition. And finally, I'll mention the topic of this edition, of the focus of this edition, that is climate change. But first of all, I'd like to highlight something about the index. What is the WeWorld Index? The WeWorld Index is a tool that we elaborated 17 years ago to measure the inclusion of women and children around the world. But compared to other indexes, the WeWorld Index has some features that I want to remind you. First of all, it considers inclusion as a multidimensional concept. In line with the Agenda 2030, inclusion is considered a multidimensional concept which regards not only the economic sphere, but also the social and environmental sphere. The same does the WeWorld Index. Inclusion of women and children is considered under different dimensions: health, education, political participation, violence against children, gender violence, and so on. Secondly, the WeWorld Index considers women's rights strictly related with children's rights. What is meant? We believe that if we promote women's rights and inclusion, we have a positive effect of children's rights and inclusion, and vice versa. And the third, the WeWorld Index underlines the fact that a legal framework is important to promote women's and children's rights, but it is not enough. It is fundamental to put women and children in the condition to exercise their right. In other words, it is important to favor the acquisition of their capabilities. And how to do? In order to promote the acquisition of capabilities of women and children, we have to act in 4 areas, which we call the 4 building blocks. They are education, health, economy, and society. And as Marco said before, we have to act in a holistic way. We have to promote the acquisition of capabilities in all these areas jointly, in an interdependent and simultaneous way. Of course, all these processes happen in a specific cultural and environmental setting. So we have also to consider this setting, the environmental and cultural settings, and social and cultural norms which exist in a particular setting, in a particular context, in order to favor the acquisition of capabilities of women and children. How the WeWorld Index is made up? It is a synthetic made of which consists of 34 indicators grouped in the 17 dimensions, and they refer to the 4 building blocks. In this slide, you can see all the dimensions of the WeWorld Index. And in 2020, we added 3 new indicators, which refers to the pandemic, in order to take into account the consequences of the pandemic on women and children's conditions and well-being. And in this edition, in the 2021 edition, we did the same things. We consider these these 3 new indicators. So the index is the synthesis of these 37 indicators. The result is a worldwide ranking of the world. Turning to the main result of these editions, as you can see from this map, the ranking is divided into 5 groups. Every year we divided the ranking into 5 groups according to the level of inclusion of women and children around the world. And as you can see, this year, the countries colored in green are those countries where women and children live good inclusion or sufficient inclusion. So the north of Europe plus New Zealand and Australia. Whereas the worst countries in the ranking are those colored in red, African countries plus Afghanistan, where children and women live forms of severe exclusion or very severe exclusion. Another things that I want to underline is the number of countries included in the last 2 groups, very severe exclusion, and insufficient inclusions, because they are 110 countries out of 172 countries. So in more than 2/3 of countries worldwide, women and children suffer different forms of exclusions, a high number. Going to the focus of these editions, that is the climate change. In the focus of these editions, we consider the impact of climate change on women and children's rights and inclusions and well-being. And we consider the fact that climate change does not affect everyone equally. But some categories, women and children, but also, for example, people who live below the poverty line, refugees, ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, and so on, are the most at risk, are the most excluded and the most affected by the consequences of climate change. So, in our opinion, it is important to consider climate change not only as an environmental issue, but especially a question of social justice. And the same is if we consider countries, we look at countries. As you can see in this map, the most affected countries are low-income countries, which are those who contribute less to the problem, to the issue of climate change. Considering the effect on children and women, we tried to, in the focus of this edition, to summarize the main consequences of women and children's lives. There are many. Here you can see some of them, and for example, I'd like to quote the fact that children and women risk to be exploited in the labor market or sexually exploited. they can suffer from poverty, migration, limited access to water and food, and malnutrition, or also problem regarding their psychological and mental health. Obviously, the only long-term solution to the climate change is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but we think that some action could be implemented to try to reduce the exposure of women and children to the consequences of climate change and of climate crisis. In this sense, WeWorld operates trying to implement in its programs mitigation measures and adaptation measures, both these kind of interventions, plus a transversal intervention that is the awareness raising and advocacy measures. Mitigation measures are all those action and measures aimed at reducing causes and limiting practices global warming is based on, whereas adaptation measures are those actions aimed at mitigating the effect of climate change, which introduce, for example, nature-based solutions, or, for example, intervention aimed at making the communities more resilient. And in this sense, for example, WeWorld tries in its program around the world to implement both mitigation measures and adaptation measures. Mitigation measures such as, for example, distribution of indigenous seeds to contribute to the diversification, or, for example, the promotion of good agricultural practices, agroforestry, and so on. And for example, regarding the adaptation measures, we try to introduce practices of disaster risk reduction and many actions aimed at promoting the economic empowerment of women. For example, to teach them innovative technologies, to teach leadership skills, and so on. And finally, we also consider very important to make people aware of climate change and of the effect of climate change on people, and in particular or on the most vulnerable people such as women and children. So awareness raising campaign, action, and advocacies are very important. And in this sense, for example, I'd like to quote our last campaign, Climate of Change campaign, of which we will see a short video later. To conclude my speech, I want only to quote some example of countries in which we try to apply mitigation measures and adaptation measures, which are in the focus of these editions: Kenya, Mozambique, Brazil, and Peru. And finally, I want to recall two important pillars of all actions on climate change. First of all, the necessity of adopting a multidimensional approach. As I said before, climate change is a question of social justice, so it is important to adopt an approach based on respect both for the planet and for human rights, and in particular the rights of people most at risk. And secondly, another important thing is to consider the importance of multilateralism. So to think at action, common strategies, which should involve governments, but not also governments, also citizens, civil society, business, young people, and of course, NGOs. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Caneva. I now welcome our next two guests, Italian Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Marina Sereni, and the Director of the Global Fund for Education and Emergency Education Cannot Wait, Yasmin Sharif. Vice Minister Sereni, you may begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabika. President Chiesara, dear participants, I am pleased to participate in this in-depth session on women and children and climate change, a topic that is deeply linked to several sustainable development goals of the 2030 Agenda and is therefore among the top priorities of the Italian development cooperation strategy. Allow me to take the time to thank WeWorld, whose index has become a reference for the protection of the fundamental rights of millions of women and children. Contributions such as the WeWorld Index are increasingly relevant for all actors of development cooperation. As they go by, it becomes increasingly evident that climate change is and will be a multiplier of some already well-known problems afflicting humanity: poverty, food and water scarcity, conflicts for the control of resources. It will also be the main cause of migrations, given that 40% of the world population, 3 billion human beings, are estimated to live in areas affected by climate change. As G20 presidency and partner of the UK for COP26, Italy has been working strenuously to ensure the success of the negotiation processes, also through constant diplomatic activity in consultation with all our partners. We have the responsibility to enable ambitious, forward-looking agreements within the pillars of the Paris Agreement and to bring forth our G20 and COP26 legacy, notably with a focus on youth empowerment in climate action, which was at the center of the Youth for Climate event in Milan. Indeed, the effects of climate change may vary among regions, income groups, gender, and generation. Women in developing countries, in rural areas especially, are particularly vulnerable as they are highly dependent on local natural resources for their livelihood. It is therefore important to identify gender-sensitive strategies for responding to human security needs and environmental and humanitarian crises caused by climate change. It is also important to remember that women are also effective actors and agents of change in relation to both mitigation and adaptation. In this regard, I recall the commitment of the Italian government in the concrete implementation of the Sustainable Development Goal number 5, which foresees the achievement of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. This has been and will be a key priority of our international action. Within the G20 presidency framework, I also recall that Italy has particularly stressed the issue of gender equality by organizing the first G20 ministerial conference entirely dedicated to women empowerment, which took place in Santa Margherita Ligure in late August. In December 2020, the Italian Development Cooperation also adopted a set of guidelines on gender equality and the empowerment of women, girls, and young girls for the period 2020-2024. Italy is also engaged in international campaigns for the eradication of all harmful practices against women and girls, such as female genital mutilation and child early and forced marriage, including by promoting and actively participating in the negotiation on related resolutions of the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. I seize this occasion to talk about children. They are, of course, more fragile and vulnerable to extreme weather events. and suffer more directly from the consequences of poor health care and access to nutrition. The dangers are more severe from a long-term perspective. They are more subject to indirect effects of climate change, such as scarcity of food and water, resource management conflicts, economic precariousness, and migration. As far as education is concerned, children affected by climate catastrophes are at high risk of being unable to attend school for a long time, and some may never return to their studies. Quality education, Sustainable Development Goal number 4, is today more than ever one of the top priorities of the Italian development cooperation. As a matter of fact, ensuring quality education systems anywhere in the world is a determining factor in making societies more equitable, in reconciling communities in conflict, and in ensuring sustainable development. Italy also actively joined the recent G7 declaration on girls' education. With this declaration, we called on the international community to join forces to deliver 40 million more girls in school by 2026 in low and lower middle income countries, and 20 million more girls reading by age 10 or at the end of primary school in low and lower middle income countries by 2026. In conclusion, we believe it to be pivotal to put at the center of the action of the Italian development cooperation the full development of the person, of the human capital. Human capital is a development multiplier which counteracts the climate change as a threat multiplier, with the aim to generate prosperity at the local level so that everyone can enjoy prosperous and satisfying lives. The World Index speaks clearly. There is still a long way to go before we can bridge the gap of exclusion, especially of women and children, in many countries at all levels of development. The Italian cooperation continues to actively intervene in this matter, also in the dialogue with our partners' countries, keeping the prevention and protection of women and girls from all forms of violence a top priority of our international cooperation action. Indeed, the road to improve the condition of women and children in the world and allow countries to climb the positions of the WeWorld Index is often fraught with obstacles, but the results obtained must be an incentive as well as the urgency dictated by the need to implement the 2030 Agenda goals. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your insight, Vice Minister. I now ask Ms. Sharif to share her experience with all of us. Ms. Sharif, please, you have the floor. Your microphone is still on mute, I believe.
Oh, sorry, I didn't. Thank you so very much. And I want to start by saying that it's wonderful to see Minister Sereni again. We had a wonderful, lovely meeting, very inspiring in Rimini this summer. So I'm so glad that we are reconnecting again.
It's a pleasure for me to see you again.
Thank you, my dear. Thank you. Grazie. So I'm very delighted to be here with you today. I have to find the camera where to look. I think there's something here. Do I look at you now when I speak? Right, yes, I'm looking at you. So I want to thank the WeWorld team and also to congratulate you on the great report and also the appreciation I feel for having this opportunity to be part of this panel and distinguished guests. And I would like to thank the government of Italy, a country that I love, and the beautiful civil society, Italian civil society that leads this critical agenda for education in emergencies, critically important. It's probably one of the most important issues of our times. And keeping highlighting that importance with such passion and strength, and bringing that together with climate change, which is another top priority of our times. Now, the WeWorld Index suggests that we need to adopt multidimensional interventions, and that education is one of the most important ones. So we have a holistic approach, but at the center of that is education. Without education, nothing else can be achieved. It's the very fundamental. And this is, we share with you precisely the same philosophy and mission and vision. That the role of education cannot wait is precisely the same. That's why it's so important for us to join forces. We believe, we advocate, and we tell the world, and we make it happen through action, that education sits at the heart of all human rights and requires a multidimensional approach to achieve protection, to achieve safety, and mental well-being for the young generation. And I'm also delighted to see the outcome of the report, and that, you know, the outcome being that we need to see increased funding and financing to education, and that is the most strategic investment we can take if we want to create a more humane, fair, and just world. Education, it starts there. And that yeah, I think also that WeWorld Index is really highlighting this, that this is the driving force. Education is a driving force for equal opportunities, for economic inclusion, access to resources, and so forth. Now, because of the brilliant work that has been done and the critical findings, I am again happy to see my dear friend, the Deputy Foreign Minister Sereni, but we really would love, we need Italy to be, and I see it by us being here together today, to be that driving force. And I would like to invite you again, Italy, because I love your country, but also because you're driving the agenda. Please join Education Cannot Wait. And you will learn more about Education Cannot Wait when my dear colleague and friend from Italy, Marco, will later on make a presentation from World Vision, and he will present ECW. Because at the end of the day, we are all Education Cannot Wait. We are all impatient, and we want to deliver education to children and adolescents, and especially girls who are affected by crisis. And climate change is one of the toughest crises we are facing. Just look at South Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa. An estimated 140 million people will be displaced by climate change by 2050. 140 million simply because of climate change in these parts of the world. And we also see on the positive side where there is a strong investment in education, and especially in girls' education, those countries that have made that investment in education and girls' education have fewer losses when it comes to when they are affected by droughts or floods than countries that have a lower level of girls' education or a lower investment in education overall. So I think this is the time to start. If we want to address climate change, educate the new generation and give emphasis on girls' education to prevent climate change from continuously spreading, to mitigate it when it happens, and to quickly recover from it when it happens. But it will require funding. It will require to address both the preventive action at the short term and the long term, and mitigate and make sure, and the reparative action, the disastrous effects of it or impact. So I think bringing climate change and education together, I think the correlation is very, very clear. When there is a climate change disaster, which we see increasingly in the countries or regions I mentioned, we see forced displacement. And where there's forced displacement, there is a disruption in education. And where there's a disruption in education, a country, its girls, its boys, they also lose out on the most important opportunity that we can invest in for any human being to reach the potentials, to become educated, and to build strong nations that can respect human rights, withstand conflict, and bring peace to the world. So I think the correlation is very clear. And I would again like to thank WeWorld and congratulate you and the Child Fund Alliance and congratulate you on the 2021 Global Index launch. Congratulations, well done. Very, very solid report. And then again, I know that my dear friend Marco will soon be speaking, and he will tell you much more about Education Cannot Wait than I have done. And because he represents a very strong civil society organization, World Vision, but he also represents ECW, Education Cannot Wait, because we are all Education Cannot Wait, and we are all one humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your inspiring and motivating words, Ms. Sharif. For this second half of our live, I would like to welcome Ms. Lia Romano, Emergency Program Coordinator for WeWorld in Mozambique, Mr. Marco Grazia, Global Director for Child Protection and Education in Emergencies, and also member of Education Cannot Wait's Executive Committee, and Ms. Meg Gardiner, Secretary General of Child Fund Alliance. Thank you all for being with us today. Let's begin with Ms. Romano. Please, can you tell us a little bit more about WeWorld's work in Mozambique?
Yes. So, boa tarde from Mozambique. Yes, I'm going to introduce the impact of climate change in the country with focus on women and children, and also the action that we are carrying on in the country. Mozambique is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, and is exposed to several extreme weather events like flood, drought, cyclone. And this situation, of course, aggravated the situation of absolute poverty. Mozambique is slowly recovering from 16 years of civil war. And so most of the people depend on subsistence farming, which success or failure is strictly related to the weather conditions. Here I have just reported some data regarding the disaster risk assessment, and the recent most severe disaster in the last decade, like the cyclone in 2000 with 800 dead people, then El Niño in 2015, 2016, which was let's say the worst drought in the last 35 years. And then also recently, we have the counterpart, El Niño, with the Idai cyclone in 2019, that followed by Kenneth cyclone in the same year after just 1 month. And then in 2020, the tropical storm Chalene, followed by the tropical storm Eloise. Just to have an idea of the impact of a cyclone on the country, I reported here the consequences of the Idai cyclone in Mozambique, with 600 people dead and 1.85 million people in need. Of course, the losses that we have after a disaster, after a crisis, are more higher than the one that we can quantify, because we know that we have direct impact, indirect impact, but among them we have unquantifiable impact, unquantifiable losses. Let's see what's happened with the girls, women, and children. Of course, the gender inequalities and discrimination create a disproportionate impact on women and girls. And also this situation finally exacerbates the inequality and the discrimination. It's like, how I can say, like a vicious circle, you know? And on this part of the slide, I reported this scheme of the NGO CARE regarding the impact of climate change on economic, social, and environmental sector. And so we can talk for 4 hours, but we don't have so much time. So just to make an example, after drought, so we have no or reduce water access. We have food insecurity, and we have not to forget that the women here are very young, and sometimes, and most of them, are facing this disaster, this crisis, for the first time in their life, and for the first time they have to provide food and income for themselves and for their children in this emergency context. And so usually they are not able to identify strategy to address the basic need. So what's happened? They can provide only 1 food per day. They have to walk for 2 hours or sometimes also 6 just for collecting water. And this increases the chance, the possibility of gender-based violence, and increase also the child marriage, because the family usually cannot provide food for their children, and so they use to give the girls to hold their men. On the side of the children, also we know that children suffer more severe physical effects because they are more vulnerable, they are weaker. And also considering the long-term effect, they can have physical, psychological, and educational deficit. Of course, as indirect impact, because of adults cannot take care of their family, we have effect on children care, protection, and support system. For example, considering the two cyclones of 2019, the number of children in need arrive close to 1.3 million. Of course, education is the problem on education is an indirect impact of the disaster, because the cyclones can affect, can damage the buildings, or also because the schools are used as a shelter during the crisis, during the emergency, or also because the access road to the school have obstacles. And so we can understand, for example, in Mozambique, with the two cyclones in 2019, and also the then epidemic effect of COVID in 2020 up to now, there are a lot of millions of children which have not access to education. So climate change is expected to lead to greater variability. We came from the COP26. We know that UN climate reports say that some changes are already irreversible. So what we have to do? We have to adapt. And Mozambique is placing a special emphasis on the prevention of natural disaster and on improving early warning system. And also taking adaptation measures on agriculture, fisheries, energy, environmental, water sector. And as WeWorld GLSE, we are working with the INGD, Instituto Nacional de Gestão de Desastres, in a program funded by ECO. We are working on SDG number 13 to strengthen the national and local capacity to prepare for and to face, to respond to disaster. What we do? We work within the whole emergency management cycle, implementing flood forecasting model, training institution, governmental institution, improving the early warning system and the early action system, creating community and school-based committee of disaster risk reduction. The community-based disaster risk reduction committee is composed by volunteers that belong to the community. We train them, we equip them to be the first to intervene in an emergency. And they are very important because they play a key role in reducing damage and death, especially in the most remote community where help takes weeks to arrive. Let's say that a good early warning system, an early action system can reduce of 75% the losses in a community. And doing this, in this DRR mechanism, we work with the focus also on women. We have a gender mechanism, a DRR mechanism gender sensitive. Why? Because we want to promote and strengthen the women participation in the decision-making process of the communities, but also we want to get a wide perception on the different risks related to gender, which we know that are different from the one of the one of female are different from the one of the male, and then also the women bring with them the issue of children. Here, I want to show some picture of this committee with their equipment and some members in action. We will see then the video, I think, but here there are some pictures with women in action, sometimes with children together with them. And then regarding our action in the school, also there we create a committee composed by volunteers belonging to school, which are students, professors, members of the school board. We train, equip them to plan, to coordinate and implement the disaster risk reduction action. They elaborate and implement the emergency plan for the school and educate the school community on disaster risk management. They are very important in the management of the shelter, because usually the building of the school are used as a shelter during the emergency. Also in this approach, the 50%, this committee, the 50% of the members are female. Here, just I show this emergency plan for the school. It's the implementation of a methodology of UN Habitat. And so each school has this plan with the emergency contact list, the school context, the risk profile, and also the actions for disaster risk management. Action before, during, and after the crisis. The committee is elected through an assembly in the school. So as you can see, members are children, are also students of the school. We train them through a participatory approach in order to develop the map risk, in order to understand the vulnerability of the school and to identify the evacuation route, to identify the meeting point. They have also to understand, as I told you, the vulnerability of the school. You can see here some picture of schools affected by cyclones in 2019 with the damage on roof, damage on the wall. So within this action, also we identify and we fund intervention in the school to reduce the vulnerability of the school and so the risk for the school population. Yes, we have
Ms. Romano, I'm afraid we're going to have to, ask you to quickly finish up so that we can show a video of your work on field.
Yes, I finished right now.
Okay, thank you very much then.
Yes.
Thank you. We are now going to integrate the words of Ms. Lia Romano's experience with some images from Mozambique. We're going to watch an extract from Side by Side, a documentary film produced by WeWorld and funded by the European Union Humanitarian Aid that shows the effects of Cyclone Idai, which hit Mozambique in 2019. So I request the IT department to please launch the video.
Cyclone Idai chegou no dia 15 de março de 2019 e começou por a ventania e um pouco de chuva. Depois, às 22 horas, quando as pessoas estavam a dormir, a cheia chegou. E assim foi, graças a Deus, para as pessoas travar, porque subimos em cima das árvores. Tinha 25 pessoas, outra árvore 10, outra árvore 15 pessoas. E assim é como nós a salvamos.
Ciclone fecha 0 horas e minha mãe me acordou. Fátima, acorda para mim, para mim fugir. E eu acordei na cama e pisei embaixo assim, a água já está a chegar aqui. Minha mãe disse, vamos subir na árvore, porque quando eu fugir aqui, não vamos chegar onde essa água pode nos pegar cedo. Muito frio, a chuva estava a chover e eu não tinha nada de comer. Estava com muito fome, estava com medo de frio. E eu tinha medo de ser pegado com sono e cair naquela água aí e eu morrer. E nós ficamos 3 dias naquela árvore, sem comer, nem cobrir, manda, nem o quê.
A essa hora, às 4, para verificar o estado da viatura. Tinha ficado uma chuva miúda. Percebi que havia movimento de pessoas no pavilhão de desportos. Aquilo preocupou-me. O que realmente estava a acontecer? Tive que aproximar para tentar entender o que estava a acontecer. Mas quando chego no ginásio, encontro todo o ginásio repleto de pessoas e seus bens. Nos posicionar já cá na escola para estar a fazer o registro e a acomodação dessas pessoas. Então, nós registrávamos número de família e número de desaparecidos. Porque vinham adultos e eu subi na árvore com 3, 4 crianças, mas não consegui segurar todas. 2 crianças caíram na água. Então, foi um momento que
muito forte. Opa, situação complicada mesmo. Misericórdia, é uma situação que ninguém esperava.
não posso reportar isso.
Muito difícil.
Estamos nos retratando, reconstituindo, mas até agora o impacto direto de Idai ainda está nas comunidades, nas nossas mentes. Precisamos ainda de um tempo para voltarmos a uma vida normal.
What we just saw is a very emotional testimony. We are now going to watch another video, another one of young actors who participated in a competition on sustainable environment Exponi, which was organized by WeWorld, and who promote the climate of change campaign. So I once again request our amazing IT department to launch this video. Thank you.
Un clima di cambiamento è un clima in cui si parla di tutte le questioni legate alla giustizia sociale per capire come far fronte al cambiamento climatico.
Adesso vi racconto 3 semplici azioni che possiamo fare insieme per contrastare il cambiamento climatico. Primo, prestiamo attenzione al nostro impatto ambientale. Quando per esempio vogliamo comprare qualcosa di nuovo, chiediamoci prima se davvero ci serve. Secondo, attiviamoci sul nostro territorio, creiamo dei momenti di sensibilizzazione pubblica. E terzo, uniamoci, facciamo rete, solo così riusciamo davvero a portare avanti le nostre istanze.
Ritengo che il cambiamento climatico possa essere contrastato da ognuno di noi nel proprio piccolo, secondo azioni quotidiane come il controllo dello spreco di acqua quando ci si lava i denti o si fa la doccia, preferire per esempio mezzi di trasporto meno inquinanti come la bicicletta e soprattutto effettuare la raccolta differenziata così da riciclare i rifiuti.
Chiediamo che l'Europa torni ad assumersi la responsabilità della piena tutela dei diritti umani delle persone in arrivo ai suoi confini, senza delegare ai paesi di transito la gestione dei flussi migratori. Urge una strategia integrata e di dimensione europea, capace di fornire quelle risposte che gli approcci settoriali e limitati all'ambito nazionale non sono riusciti a produrre.
Questo è l'unico modo per uscire sani e migliorati da una crisi grave come quella del clima.
It is very inspiring to watch such active and inspired youth. So thank you for those videos, WeWorld. And we are now ready to listen to Mr. Marco Grazia, whose speech will be particularly relevant from a perspective of multilateralism, a fundamental and necessary approach to promote synergies and good practices, especially in a delicate context such as that of education in emergency. So Mr. Grazia, you now have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabika, and thank you all honorable guests and panelists. And first of all, let me congratulate again WeWorld for the great report and the great index that they have produced. I would like really to join our director, Yasmin Sharif, in congratulating you for this great work. Again, as Ms. Sharif has said, I feel that I am education cannot wait, although I am also working for World Vision International. And I'm sitting in the executive committee of Education Cannot Wait. So I decided purposely not to use World Vision logo in this presentation because I feel that I'm presenting on behalf of Education Cannot Wait. And I want to give you a bit of an insight of what Education Cannot Wait is and what is the vision and mission and what is the value added, what are the results, and how the civil society is really engaged and really supporting all the efforts that Education Cannot Wait put on the ground to support children in crisis and in emergency context to support their rights to education. So what Education Cannot Wait is the only global multilateral fund dedicated to education in emergency and protracted crisis. It was created in 2016 during the World Humanitarian Summit by international humanitarian and development aid actors. And it was really the right response to the chronic underfunding of education in crisis and to overcome those systemic barriers that we have seen as humanitarians in many crisis contexts. The situation has improved since then, but still there is a big need to provide support to those countries that they found themselves in crisis context. Therefore, that's the reason why such a high target of 1.8 billion to be raised by 2021 to reach 8.9 million children in more than 25 countries. This is not obviously the overall needs for education in emergency, but definitely it's a great contribution that Education Cannot Wait has put on the table. Education Cannot Wait is hosted by UNICEF, but it's an independent body. So it has its own executive committee that I'm proud of being part of. It has its own high-level steering group. And it does not implement directly, but provide funds, facilitate the implementation by different actors. So I will not probably spend so much in going through the vision and the mission, because already Ms. Sharif has very well explained that the vision is really to provide quality education for all children in safety. And that is an important element, because it goes back to one of those elements that were mentioned at the very beginning by Ms. Caneva, of looking at integrated approach. And that is one of the core elements of new programming for Education Cannot Wait, is to promote integration across different sectors. The mission is to generate this greater shared political, operational, and financial commitment. And it's a mission that we deliver along a different constituency. So the political commitment comes from donors, comes from hosting country, comes from private sector as well, and comes from civil society. And that is another important element, that civil society is not only represented by international organization, but also by local organization, by youth association, by teachers organizations. So that's another important element that create those shared ownership of the vision and the mission of Education Cannot Wait. Therefore, how do we plan and respond collaboratively? How do we strengthen each other's capacity to respond? And how we improve accountability lies the foundation of the core function of Education Cannot Wait. Going back to what I said before, the origin of Education Cannot Wait, definitely there is the bring into the center, bring into the humanitarian response education in emergency and protected crisis. The other element is to leveraging additional financing. And that is an increasing objective. We have seen in the last generation of programs funded by ECW that is becoming even an objective per se, how we are able to leverage additional funding for supporting education in emergency response. The multi-year dimension is also another important aspect, an added value, because it proactively promotes more collaboration across the humanitarian and the development spectrum, and therefore brings to the same table actors that are working in the humanitarian context and actors that are working more in the development context. And that is done delivering at humanitarian speed, but with development depth. And this is a wonderful definition, because it gives us the sense of how we are able to respond to immediate needs, but also how we are looking into longer term and how we are looking into building the resilience of those systems that need to cater for education needs of children. I've already mentioned the involvement of the local actors that are not only local NGOs, but are a wider spectrum of actors. I've already mentioned youth association, teachers association, and obviously local NGOs that are partner. The other element that I think it's important to mention here is the agility to work through existing systems. So Education Cannot Wait is using the existing humanitarian coordination mechanism, going through the cluster system, and therefore does not duplicate those structure, but makes the best use of them to promote this dialogue across humanitarian and development. Briefly going to the operational side of Education Cannot Wait, we do have 3 main funding windows. One funding windows that is called the first emergency response that typically lasts for 1 year. It has usually a funding fund of between 1 and 3 million, and it's increasingly acting with more speed. For example, in Mozambique, I do remember it was funding were disbursed within 4 weeks from the declaration of the emergency of the cyclone Idai. Multi-year resilience program have a longer breadth, and they have a specific target for protracted crisis. They last between 2 and 4 years, and the budget average between 6 and 12 million. But again, one important element here is that multi-year resilience plan are becoming more and more an element to mobilize additional resources. So these funds that are provided through multi-year resilience plan could be considered sort of seed funding for achieving broader outcomes. And then there is this acceleration facility that is looking at that element of capacity building, of strengthening existing tools and promoting through interagency efforts global goods. And these initiatives are usually funded within the time frame of 1 up to 2 years, and they average the 5% of the total trust fund. Just to give you a bit of a sense of the reach and the impact of Education Cannot Wait. In 2020, Education Cannot Wait disbursed 138 million. Of those 138, 45.4 were disbursed for responding to the pandemic of COVID-19 in 32 countries. There were 8 new multi-year resilience plans developed. That means that 8 new countries that found themselves in protracted crisis have received funding. And it's also important, if you look at the map that I'm showing here on the screen, to see that most of those countries are those countries that are ranked in the lowest tier of the index of WeWorld. So we are responding where the needs are. In terms of mobilizing resources up to 2020, so this is a cumulative figure, ECW have mobilized 684 million plus, and has leveraged 1 billion, more than 1 billion in 10 initial MERP response country. That means that the seed funding, what I was calling before, the seed funding have had an impact, a multiplier impact, because they have catalyzed the investment of donors, private foundation, to further support education and emergency response in those countries. Very often are those forgotten crises. I won't go back to the analysis that was made in our result report, in the last result report. I think you can easily have access to the result report through the website of ECW. But basically, we have seen that there are 4 main trends that have negatively affected access to education for children and adolescents. And climate change ranking as one of the most important trends that is impacting on the right to children to access education. Conflict and violence, that very often is an interlinked cause of disruption for children and their fulfillment of the right to education. And displacement obviously has a very interconnected nature with that. The element of working across different sectors, adopting what is called an holistic approach, and substantiating this holistic approach through the nexus, through the dialogue between humanitarian and development actors, is what can be said as one of the value added of the efforts put on the ground by Education Cannot Wait. I give you some more details in terms of the reach. And again, I want to emphasize here the gender perspective, the fact that in all Education Cannot Wait funded programs, there is a gender lens that is looking not only at the quantitative element. So you can see here that, for example, in 2020, the total reach was 2.6 million, of which 48% by girls, but it's also looking at a qualitative aspect when dealing with the gender perspective in multi-year resilience plan and in first emergency response. The main target or the main reach as of now remain the primary level education, although progress are made also in pre-primary and secondary, with an ambitious target of 10% for pre-primary, which is a constant dialogue with many of the civil society organizations that are advancing the agenda for promoting more investment also in early childhood education and development. I want to give you like the last in the last part of my presentation, I want also to give you a bit of a sense of how Education Cannot Wait works and what is the role of the international NGO and more broadly the civil society representation in Education Cannot Wait. Obviously, Education Cannot Wait has a secretariat that has an agile structure, and it follows the day-to-day operations and support the work of the other governance body, facilitate the grant process, provide technical support to the recipient of the funds, so what they call the grantee, and track the progress of the investment. But the real mechanism to participate in ECW are the high-level steering group and the executive committee. While the high-level steering group of ECW has this role for providing a political and strategic oversight on the decision-making, the executive committee has this more operational oversight. And as mentioned before, World Vision currently sits in both group, in the steering group and in the executive committee, along with colleagues from the local NGO, the teachers, and the youth association. And I want to flag this as an important progress ECW has made to make even more inclusive ownership of the funds by the civil society organization, because since this year, the seats in the high-level steering group and the executive committee have increased from 1 to 4 seats for the civil society organization. I'm very proud that we are bringing the voice to ECW in those two important forums. And if I can also make my own call for colleagues from the civil society organization of Italy to join us in this effort to make our voice heard and to contribute to the development of the fund, please join us in those forums where we bring the voice of civil society organization. We do have mechanisms for internal coordination, and at the end of my presentation, you have my email if you want to reach out to me to have more information on how to do so. But in particular, I'd like to mention one initiative, and it's my last slide, so I will be very brief. We have launched a campaign, what we call an Education in Emergency Champions campaign, with the objective to increase the uptake of the crisis-affected children and youth needs and demands, and therefore to contribute to that political uplift for education in emergency, and to support the efforts of ECW to mobilize additional resource. And in the lead up of the high-level event for the replenishment of the trust fund, this campaign will contribute. Currently, we have two bodies. One is the Education in Emergency Champions Group that has been formed a month ago by more than 40 organizations now. It remains open, and I'm very glad that WeWorld has joined the EIE Champions Group recently. And then we have an Education and Emergency Coordination Group that consists of 11 organizations and still remain open, and it manage the day-to-day planning for the campaign. So this is another opportunity for civil society organization to contribute to the trust fund management, but also to uplift the voice of civil society organization, and at the end of the most vulnerable children in need of education in emergency and protracted crisis. Well, thank you very much, and I'll leave you with my email in case you want to have additional information on how the civil society organization coordinates all the efforts to represent our voice in Education Cannot Wait governance. Thank you.
Thank you for such an in-depth explanation of the work you're carrying forward as an organization, Mr. Grazia. I now introduce to you all Ms. Meg Gardiner, Secretary General of Child Fund, the global alliance joined by WeWorld 1 year ago. So despite the difficulties due to the pandemic, Child Fund has continued to work to protect, promote, and implement the rights of children across the world, counting on a dense network of members. So Ms. Gardiner, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And what a pleasure to be here, and congratulations to WeWorld for their launch of yet another powerful index that will be a vital tool for us in our advocacy with governments and liaising with partners on the critical issues that you've highlighted. We very much benefited from what you did last year. And of course, this year with that focus on climate change, it provides a really good entree point for some of the issues that were raised at COP. So many, many thanks. I have 10 minutes, and what I've been asked to do are three things. Brief presentation on Child Fund Alliance, a little bit about the impact of COVID on children over the last 2 years, and how these issues are being exacerbated by climate change. Now, a lot of really important points have been made today, so I'll probably be reinforcing some of the things that I heard already. And when talking about the impact of COVID on children, I will talk a little bit about our COVID-19 global plan and some. Okay, so over to the first issue here. I'm just going to go to the next slide. Child Fund is composed of 12 child-focused development agencies, including WeWorld, which just joined a year ago this past November. Our overall role is to help children and their families overcome poverty and the conditions that prevent children from reaching their potential. Together, we reach nearly 23 million children and family members in 70 countries. And one of the things we do together as the Alliance, and many of our members do a multiple number of things in their own capacity, but as the Alliance, we work to end violence and exploitation against children, provide expertise in emergencies and disasters to ease the harmful impact on children and their communities. The work that Leah talked about on disaster risk management with schools is very near and dear to us. Thank you very much for that, Leah. And what we try to do, like many other organizations with whom we partner, is just to take our commitment, our resources, our innovation, our knowledge and expertise, and try to transform the lives of children around the world. And we very much want to change the world with children. Child participation is a component, a vital component of our work. We often talk about our work under the 3 Ps. We do all we can to prevent violence at all levels, from the domestic to the community to the global, protect children from violence and exploitation, especially in armed conflict and humanitarian disasters, and enable children to meaningfully participate in decisions related to achieving the SDGs. And again, just want to commend WeWorld on the video they showed us about climate change and young people. Very, very powerful. We have just adopted a new strategic plan, excuse me, for the next 4 years. And WeWorld was part of that process to help us deliver on that. We've identified 3 priorities. 1, addressing emerging threats to children's safety. 2, working together as one. And 3, building partnerships for sustainable growth. On number 1, addressing emerging threats to children's safety take the form of 2 campaigns. The first campaign, which we're just about to launch in the first quarter of FY22, is on online safety. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the things we learned through COVID on online safety. The second campaign, which is still yet to be determined, could very well address the issue of climate change and potentially the relationship between climate change and violence, but more on that much later. Okay. A little bit about our program Forward Strong. In April of 2020, Child Fund members unified under an umbrella approach to address the issues that were surfacing over COVID-19. This is before WeWorld joined, so we will not, the data that I'm sharing with you is not reflective of WeWorld in this particular case. But we did commit in April of 2020 to leveraging $56 million to help reach 6.3 million children. And following a year-long effort, we exceeded this goal, reaching more than 6.8 million beneficiaries, children and their families, during implementation of our these pandemic-related activities. And we also directed more than 100 million to relief efforts, and this was both newly raised funds and redirected funds, some of which were from sponsorship. And 2 major threats to children, hunger and violence, formed the heart of our 1-year COVID-19 response plan. And we prioritized 4 key areas. We added a 5th. I'll go through the first 4. Stopping children from stopping COVID from infecting children and their families. That's prevention. Getting children the food they need, nutrition. Keeping children safe from violence, both physically and emotionally, protection. Helping children continue their learning, on education. And then we added a 5th area on elevating children's voices, both their perspectives and their solutions. We learned a few things. Many of them are in our COVID-19 report, which I'd be happy to share with you. But I did want to just highlight one thing we learned about the digital system, since it does correlate with some of the things we'll be trying to do with our campaign on online safety. Members found that having a digital system in place during COVID, in addition to adequate mapping of financial institutions, was essential to the successful delivery of cash assistance and food baskets. And we did learn an awful lot about cash transfers through this response. I know that WeWorld has a specialist working in the cash transfer area. This was something that we found could be done a lot more effective and faster if the right our investments in digital technologies to help bridge the digital divide in education and other key areas, development areas, and we'll get into that a little bit in a minute. And the other key learning, no surprise here, is just that the ability to pivot quickly is essential to being able to provide relevant resources and activities online in order to respond to participant needs. And many of our members reported if they were strong and had their infrastructure in place before the pandemic, they were agile and nimble enough to quickly pivot and respond to COVID. So some important learnings for all of us during this, what started as a humanitarian crisis and has moved to a long-term development crisis. We also learned that use of social media platforms for communication, messaging, coaching, and mentoring was very effective. And again, one of the things that we're recommending is that for our members and the larger communities we serve to invest in technology capacity and life skills for young people. And one of the we have two focus areas on our forthcoming strategy on online safety. One is to reduce the threats to children online. That's more of the protection. But then along with our participation mandate, we're really focusing on digital literacy. How do you equip young children, older children, and parents to navigate themselves safely online? Again, empowering children to take advantage of what's online. We know that not all young children we serve have access to the internet, but as the band increases, we identify this as an emerging area, an emerging threat and opportunity for children that we should respond to more carefully. So again, we're just saying essential to train teachers and children in the use of digital tools to facilitate their skills in an increasingly online world without them being emotionally overwhelmed. And again, if you want more details, we will share with you some of the plans that we have for our first campaign on online safety, which is going to be launched quite soon. Now, just a word about the second component of this presentation, which is, what was the impact of COVID on children? And I see that my time is almost up, so I'm just going to say a few quick things. Number one, the COVID-19 pandemic caused the largest global mass disruption to education systems in history, forcing school closures in 190 countries and affecting 90% of the world's students at risk. UNICEF estimates that school children around the world lost an estimated 1.8 trillion hours of in-person learning, and this is increasing. Just wanted to highlight that because of the work that WeWorld does in education, and the work that's being done in education cannot wait. And all of you have mentioned this, what education brings with it, so many opportunities for children that were lost during the pandemic. We've just got a lot of work to do. Glad to hear that the Education Cannot Wait has started that trust fund. We also know that child labor rose during the pandemic. And this is, of course, of acute concern to all of us who work with children, having been warned by the ILO and UNICEF that 8.4 million additional children are at risk of work as a result of COVID-19. We know that the numbers of child marriages are estimated to go up, and those young girls may not return to school. So then finally, just to close with what's been said, the world is also grappling with another major ongoing crisis, and that's the climate crisis. It really is doubled as a child rights crisis because its greatest consequences are felt by children. I think our previous speaker pointed it out very well when she said this is a social justice issue. Yes, COVID impacted all of us. Yes, the climate issue impacts all of us, but those two issues, COVID and climate, disproportionately impact the most marginalized children and women. And those points were made very well. So I just want to reinforce that. We all know climate-related emergencies are and will continue to increase intensity and frequency, especially for children in fragile contexts. And we just want to kind of shout out the very acute needs and often forgotten needs of children in humanitarian settings. I know WeWorld has done a lot of work on the development humanitarian nexus, and we'll be looking at this more clearly. And while we know that children hold the power, the least power to take direct action, they've been the most vocal. And we've seen that over and over again with young people taking to the streets, powerful, eloquent youth voices. And while those numbers of voices and their sense of urgency are felt, the way that we all respond to the crisis will be an ultimate test of our accountability to children. So we see this index as a call to action, using the data, using the information in it to make the case to governments to increase investments in a lot of key areas, including this. And so just a note of thanks for giving us a floor today. Appreciate your letting me take a few more minutes to talk. And we benefited so much from the previous speakers. Just want to thank everyone who came before us. Glad that we're all in this together. Over to you.
Thank you very much for all the data, information, and the experience you shared with us, Ms. Gardiner. I am very pleased to now welcome our final speaker for today, the permanent representative of Italy to the United Nations, His Excellency Mr. Maurizio Massari. The United Nations are a symbol of multilateralism, and we strongly believe that joint actions are now more necessary than ever for the good of women and children especially. So, Your Excellency, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabika. At the end of this intense and fruitful discussion, full of insights and important inputs by many, I would like to thank and praise WeWorld and President Marco Chiesara for stimulating a debate on an important topic, such as the impact of climate change on the livelihood and human rights of women and children. A lot has been said. Allow me, therefore, to wrap up and highlight three main issues as a way to contribute to today's debate. Firstly, the perception of the effects of climate change on the global scene is linked to the capacity of the international community, states, and stakeholders to prove how devastating these effects are. Secondly, climate change cannot anymore be considered as a mere environmental issue, since it already affects the economic, social, and cultural balance of numerous communities around the world. Thirdly, the action and work of civil society organizations must be an integral part of the global effort in fighting climate change. Let us start from the first point. Secretary General Guterres defined climate change an existential threat for humanity, and the issue is rightly on the top of the international agenda. It is therefore only natural that the ongoing negotiations at COP26 in Glasgow make the headlines pretty much every day. Something is finally changing. The public opinion is asking world leaders to take concrete steps to reverse anthropogenic global warming. The reason behind the increased public perception of the danger posed by climate change is simple. Frequent extreme weather events and natural disasters, as well as converging data provided by the scientific community, clearly confirm that climate change will only get worse if we do not act now. The WeWorld 2021 Index adds another important element to the description and the consequent perception of the effects of climate change, since it actually helps to better realize how climate change is already having negative effects on the enjoyment of human and economic rights across the globe, and how these effects are more acutely felt by persons in vulnerable situations, including women and children. In brief, the WeWorld 2021 Index constitutes one more important wake-up call for the decision makers. While the debate on whether there is a human right to a clean and healthy environment is still ongoing at the global level, there are several other dimensions that speak to the strong links between the environment and human rights. Most importantly, a clean and healthy environment, including a healthy climate, it is a prerequisite for the enjoyment without distinction and discrimination of any kind of a range of recognized human rights, such as the right to life and the security of the person, to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, adequate standard of living, clothing and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. It can also be argued that actions for protecting the environment and the climate are essentials in the steps that states are required to take in realizing the substantive human rights provisions of relevant human rights instruments. In this regard, the Paris Agreement, under the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, states in its preamble that states parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider the respective obligations on human rights. Related to this dimension is also the recognition by the UN General Assembly of the human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation, which is the object of a dedicated resolution negotiated by the Third Committee of the General Assembly. The level of the international debate on the relation between climate change and human rights shows that we are only just starting to understand its full implications. But a lot of work remains to be done to translate this newly acquired awareness in our policies and actions. The UN human rights system can and should be in a position to provide its contribution on such a critical topic at such a critical juncture. And that is exactly the reason why Italy took a proactive role in promoting the recently approved Human Rights Council resolution, which establishes the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change. Finally, let me conclude by highlighting the cross-fertilization that exists between human rights and the involvement of civil society in environmental and climate action. The enjoyment of human rights, especially in regard to access to information, participation in decision-making, and access to justice in environmental matters, freedom of opinion and expression, are essential for good environmental decision-making. These rights derive from the civil and political rights enshrined in the ICCPR, and they contribute to the underpinning of the legitimacy of environmental human rights defenders. We must make sure that human rights are systematically integrated in the global action to fight climate change, ensuring that our efforts on these two fronts are mutually reinforcing, including by supporting and protecting human rights defenders acting in this field. Recently, we have also seen how young generations are willing to act as human rights and climate activists. We should follow their call to action and provide the global platforms to bring the voice of the youth at the negotiating table. That is why Italy hosted the Youth for Climate event in Milan, where 400 young people aged between 15 and 29 from 186 countries addressed the main urgencies and priorities of climate action and shared their key messages with the ministers that took part in the pre-COP26. Moreover, Italy, on the margins of COP26, announced its intention to continue supporting this form of open discussions and consultations with the youth representatives. Thank you very much again for this important discussion today, and I wish you all the best for your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And now request WeWorld President Marco Chiesara to join me once again in thanking all of you for participating, the panelists for their contributions, and all the people who followed our broadcast live. I'd like to remind you that starting from tonight, the WeWorld Index will be available online, and there will be a dashboard to help you navigate the WeWorld Index data. So Mr. Chiesara, would you like to add something? You're mute, Marco.
Sorry, but I didn't have anything to add because you told everything. So just to thank again all the panelists for such interesting debate. Really thanks for today. And so we wait for any other occasion in the future.
Okay. Do make sure you read the index because it is truly insightful. And until next time, thank you very much.
Thank you.